I am Walt, 70 years old, and until yesterday, I thought I had a family. I was zipping up my suitcase for a luxury family cruise when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my son, Derek. Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. My wife wants only her family. Those words hit me where I stood inside the guest house of a property whose deed bore my name. I read them twice, then set the phone down without a word. One by one, I pulled the tropical shirts from my bag and dropped them back on the bed. Come morning, I'd canceled the payments, put the house on the market, and cleared out. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If this is your first time, pull up a chair and stay a while. Before we get into today's story, if it moves you, tap that subscribe button, so the next one comes straight to you. Now, I'd love to know, what are you up to while you listen today? Cooking something out for a drive or just resting your feet after a long day? Drop it in the comments. A quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters. This was supposed to be a bonding trip, a real chance to get closer to my son and find some kind of footing with his wife Renee. I'd even gone out and bought a new deep-sea fishing rod and a pair of expensive polarized sunglasses just for the occasion. I was smoothing out the wrinkles on a Guayabera shirt when my phone chimed on the nightstand. I figured it would be Derek telling me they were loading up the car and we needed to head to the port. Instead, I got that short, devastating message. Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. My wife wants only her family. I read the text 3 times. I pulled off my reading glasses, pressed my fingers to the bridge of my nose, and put them back on to read it a 4th time. The words hadn't moved. The sheer audacity landed like a punch to the chest. No apology anywhere in it. No phone call to take the edge off. Just a cold, gutless text delivered on the very morning we were supposed to leave. I looked around the guest house. It was a comfortable 2-bedroom bungalow tucked onto the back half of a sprawling acre. 3 years earlier, I had moved in here, handing over the big main house to Derek and Renee so they could set up their life together without feeling crowded. I gave them room. I gave them their privacy. I gave them everything a father had to offer, and here I was being tossed aside by text because I didn't fit neatly into Renee's idea of a family vacation. A cold knot tightened in my gut, but it wasn't grief. It was clarity, sharp and absolute. I didn't fire off a reply. I didn't call him demanding answers. I crossed the room to my suitcase, took hold of the zipper, and dragged it open. One by one, out came the tropical shirts, the khakis, the new polarized sunglasses, each piece landing on the bed. The vacation was finished. The work was just starting. I settled into the chair at the small desk in the corner and flipped open my laptop. Derek and Renee had always assumed I was a retired middle manager, getting by on a modest pension. In their minds, the guest house wasn't a choice, it was all I could manage. They wore their pity like a thin coat of polish, and I had let it go on out of love for my son. What they didn't know was what Diane and I had built together. My late wife and I had constructed a logistics company from nothing. One used freight truck in the 1980s, and we grew it into a regional operation that spread across several states. When Diane passed, I sold my majority stake for a figure that meant I'd never need to chase money again. We'd kept that wealth deliberately hidden from Derek. We wanted him to earn his own way, understand what hard work was actually worth. But the moment he brought Renee into his life, a woman whose entire sense of self was tangled up in designer labels and social standing, I watched my son become someone I hardly knew. He turned entitled, arrogant, and perpetually cash-strapped under the weight of his wife's spending. I pulled up my secure banking portal. The accounts loaded on screen, millions of dollars sitting quiet and ready. I navigated to my primary corporate credit card. 2 months back, Derek had come to me frantic, going on about how badly Renee wanted this VIP cruise with her parents. He'd begged me to step in. Out of some misguided urge to keep the peace, I had quietly covered the entire $25,000 balance for their premium suites. I located the pending authorization for the cruise line. One click of the mouse, I issued a direct stop payment and kicked off a chargeback for services denied. The bank would freeze those funds before they even got to the dock. But I wasn't finished. I moved to the recurring payments tab. Every month, an automatic transfer covered the lease on Derek's luxury SUV. Canceled. Then came the auto-pay on Renee's premium tier health insurance, a policy she insisted she couldn't live without, but refused to fund herself. Canceled. I watched the confirmation screens roll in, one after another, Each one was another thread pulled from the invisible safety net I'd been quietly weaving beneath them for years. They wanted a life that had no room for me. I was simply making that official. I shut the laptop and moved to the window. Through the gap in the blinds, I had a clear sight line to the main house driveway. The front door swung open, and Derek stepped out hauling two massive designer suitcases. Renee came right behind him, travel mug in hand, laughing loudly at something he'd said. She looked immaculate, dressed in a resort outfit that probably cost more than my first car. I stood in the shadow of the guest house and watched my son. I gave him time to glance toward my window, waited for the hesitation, the flash of guilt, maybe even a last-minute walk over to knock on my door and face me. He never turned his head once. He loaded the bags into the back of the SUV, slammed the trunk, and slapped his wife a high five. They were flying. They were leaving the old man behind to fund a luxury vacation they'd never earned. The SUV's engine growled to life. Renee slid on her sunglasses and waved eagerly to her parents, who had just arrived in a separate car to convoy them to the port. Both vehicles reversed out of the driveway, swung onto the upscale suburban street in West Chase, Tampa, and sped away. The laughter thinned out. The engine noise dissolved. The property dropped into a hollow, absolute silence. I drew a long breath and let the last of my paternal guilt burn off into the still morning air. I turned from the window, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I'd had memorized for years. It rang twice before a crisp, no-nonsense voice came on. "Gordon," I said, addressing my longtime attorney, "I need you to initiate the trust restructuring we discussed last year." "Yes, all of it. And I need you to draft a cease and desist for Derek. I am officially cutting the cord." 2 hours later, a sleek black sedan rolled up the driveway. Loretta, the sharpest and most effective real estate broker in the county, climbed out with a leather portfolio under her arm. I met her in the driveway and walked her through the main house. The place was wrecked. Derek and Renee had left dirty dishes piled in the sink, damp towels thrown across the expensive leather furniture, unopened mail heaped on the dining table. It was the physical proof of everything I'd been tolerating. Loretta took in the mess with a calm, professional eye. She knew exactly what the property commanded. Developers had been circling this zip code like sharks for 5 years, hungry to snap up large lots. Like this one, tear down the older homes and throw up modern mega mansions. "I don't want to sit around waiting," Loretta, I told her as we stood in the middle of that chaotic living room. "I want an exclusive as-is immediate cash sale. Top of market retail price is not the goal. Speed is the goal. I want a buyer who can close escrow before the end of the week." Loretta smiled, sharp, predatory. "Consider it done, Walt. I've got 3 corporate developers on speed dial who will wire funds by Friday for a lot this size." She laid the listing agreement flat on the kitchen counter. I drew the pen from my pocket and signed my name on the line, legally releasing the property. We went back outside to the guest house. I picked up the leather briefcase I had packed with my passport, my financial ledgers, and the legal trust documents. I worked my keyring free, pulled off the heavy brass keys to the main house and the guest house, and carried them back to the kitchen. I set them dead center on the granite counter, right beside a stack of Derek's unpaid parking tickets. The metallic clink rang out in the empty house. I walked out, locked the door behind me, using the spare, handed that spare to Loretta, and climbed into my truck. I put it in drive and rolled off down the street. I didn't glance at the rearview mirror once. The highway opened up ahead of me, like a gray ribbon. The tires settled into a steady hum against the asphalt. For the first time in years, I let the windows down just to feel the air move. The ocean breeze was far behind me, but what came through tasted clean. I eased into the center lane and let the truck find its speed. A deep, quiet lightness spread through me. I had left the keys on the counter. I had put my name on the papers. I was no longer a guest on land I owned. I was just a man pointed forward. Then my phone started going off. It buzzed against the leather of the passenger seat. I glanced over. Derek's name lit up the screen. Then came another message, and another. The buzzing became a steady rattle. I didn't reach for it. I let it ring on the seat while I kept both eyes fixed on the road. I knew exactly where he was, and I knew exactly what was unfolding. Right about now, Derek and Renee were standing at the terminal for the luxury cruise liner. I could picture the whole scene without closing my eyes. The enormous white ship looming over the dock, the salt air and expensive perfume blending in the heavy humidity. They would be in the exclusive VIP boarding lane. Renee would be wearing her designer resort wear, gripping a leather travel bag that cost more than my first freight truck. and right there beside them would be Renee's parents. Her parents were a particular breed of awful, the kind of people who looked down at anyone who'd ever worked with their hands. They'd inherited every dollar they had and spent their days performing wealth for whoever was watching. When Derek married Renee, he married her family's expectations along with her. He poured every waking hour into proving he belonged in their circle. He bought cars he had no business financing. He took them to dinners he quietly put on credit. And he had promised them this luxury cruise experience. They expected priority boarding. They expected champagne chilled in their suites. They expected my son to manage everything without a hitch, because that is what a man of means does. My phone went quiet for a moment and then started ringing outright. Derek was calling. I let it ring. The screen flashed his photo, the one taken at his wedding. He looked so sure of himself in that picture. But right now, I knew that certainty was dissolving into raw panic. The call rolled to voicemail. 10 seconds on a fresh wave of text messages flooded in. I finally pulled off at a rest stop, just past the highway exit, put the truck in park, and lifted the phone from the seat. The messages were frantic. The first said the ticketing agent couldn't locate the reservation. The second said the booking had been flagged for a declined payment. The third demanded I call the credit card company at once to correct the bank error. A bank error. That was what he thought it was. It hadn't even entered his mind that I had pulled the plug. He was so conditioned to my quiet financial backing that he couldn't conceive of a world where I simply said no. He believed I was his personal automated teller machine, running invisibly in the background of his life. I read the next message. Dad, you need to call the bank right now. Renee is getting upset. Her parents are waiting in the VIP line and everyone is staring at us. Fix this. I sat in the still cab of my truck and pictured him at that counter. The ticketing agent in a pressed uniform would be clicking through a keyboard, politely explaining that the $25,000 charge had been reversed. Derek would be sweating through his shirt. He'd be digging through his pockets for a card that could cover the balance, and we both knew there wasn't one. His credit was stretched to its limit, just trying to keep pace with his wife. Renee would be tapping her foot. She'd be scanning the area to see whether any of her moneyed acquaintances were watching her humiliation unfold. Her mother would be murmuring something passive-aggressive to her father. Her father would be boring a hole through Derek with his eyes measuring him and finding him short. The pressure bearing down on my son would be crushing. He was standing in front of the people he'd spent years trying to impress, and he was being exposed as a fraud. Another text came through. Dad, pick up the phone. They are going to give our suites away. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I stared at those words. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? He wasn't thinking about the money. He wasn't thinking about what it took to earn that money. My late wife Diane and I had given decades of our lives to that logistics company. We spent nights stretched out on the office floor. We traded our youth for a fortune that Derek was now burning to purchase the approval of people who didn't actually care about him. He only cared about the embarrassment. He only cared about keeping his face intact in front of people who valued him solely for what he could spend. For a brief moment, a familiar paternal reflex fired in my chest. The urge to step in and shield my child from pain. For 35 years, I had been his safety net every time he fell. When he totaled his first car, I put him in a new one. When he burned through his college funds, I covered the tuition. When he wanted a house beyond his reach, I handed him mine and retreated to the guest house. My entire life had been spent absorbing the fallout from his choices. And what had all that cushioning produced? A man who would discard his own father by text message to keep his spoiled wife happy. He had treated me like dead weight when I was the very thing holding his life off the ground. I looked at the message one more time. Fix this. Not a request, not a plea. An order issued by a boy who had mistaken my generosity for ownership. I drew a slow breath. The air in the cab felt different now, entirely mine. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes something from you. It means you still believe the other person might do better. I had no such belief left, no expectations, only clarity cold and complete. I didn't answer his texts. I didn't call to spell out what I'd done. He didn't deserve that explanation. He had drawn his lines plainly enough when he told me I had no place on that trip. I was simply respecting what he'd asked for. He wanted to be the provider, the big man bankrolling a luxury getaway for his well-heeled in-laws. Now, he had every opportunity to do it on his own. I tapped the screen and pulled up his contact. I looked at his name one last time. I thought of the small boy gripping my hand at the park. I thought of the teenager talking me into teaching him to drive. Then I thought of the text this morning, tossing me out like something unwanted. I scrolled to the bottom of the menu and pressed block caller. A prompt asked whether I was certain I wanted to stop receiving calls and messages from this contact. I pressed confirm, and just like that, the line went dead. The relentless buzzing stopped. The frantic demands evaporated. The screen went dark, and the cab of my truck filled up with a deep, clean silence. I set the phone in the cup holder. I looked through the windshield at the open highway ahead. The sky above it was wide and clear and blue. No more expectations pressing down on me. No more manipulation dressed up as family. No more bending myself to accommodate people who held me in contempt. I was free and the feeling was absolute. I dropped the truck back into drive, checked my mirrors, and eased back onto the interstate. I had no real knowledge of where Derek and Renee would land by the end of the day. My guess was they'd run every card they had to the limit just to save face and board that ship. I suspected they were walking straight into a financial wreck that would eventually shatter their shallow little world. But that was their road to travel. Mine was just getting started. I pressed the accelerator and headed for the coast, putting distance between us with every mile. I stayed on the coastal highway, heading south, until I spotted a quiet motel overlooking Tampa Bay. A no-frills place, the kind that didn't probe for details and kept the Wi-Fi running. I carried my leather briefcase inside, settled it on the small wooden desk beside the window, and opened my laptop. I'd barely gotten onto the wireless network when my phone rang. The screen read, Loretta. I picked up immediately. Loretta was not the type of real estate broker who filled calls with pleasantries or soft-pedaled bad news. She called when she had something solid to report. She told me she already had 4 offers on the table. The speed didn't surprise me, and neither did the interest. To my son and his wife, that property had just been a convenient address with no mortgage attached. To the rest of the market, it was prime real estate. The house sat in a zip code that had been transformed over the past decade. When my late wife and I bought the land 30 years ago, it was a quiet, overlooked suburb. We had a generous yard shaded by old oak trees, a modest main house, and enough room to add the guest bungalow later. But over the last 10 years, the city had pushed outward fast. Major technology companies set up their headquarters nearby. The old family neighborhoods found themselves flanked by luxury apartment complexes, upscale coffee shops, and high-end organic grocery stores. Our quiet street had quietly become a gold mine. For years, I had been fielding glossy postcards and unsolicited phone calls from corporate developers waving cash at my lot. They had no interest in the hardwood floors my wife had chosen, or the custom cabinets I'd fitted with my own 2 hands. What they wanted was the dirt beneath it all. They were itching to level our history and throw up sleek modern mega mansions that squeezed every last inch from the property line. Every one of those letters went straight into the trash. I had wanted to keep the home in the family. I had wanted my son to have something solid under his feet going forward. But he didn't want a foundation. He wanted to stage a place to perform his prosperity for his wealthy in-laws. Loretta told me the top bidder was a firm called Apex Development. They'd been chasing my block for 5 years. Their offer came in at 20% above current market value, but it carried one hard condition. They needed to close right away. No inspections, no financing contingencies, no waiting around, just a clean cash transfer in exchange for clear title. I told Loretta to take it. I had no interest in haggling for a better number. I had no interest in dragging the thing out through weeks of showings and appraisals. I wanted the transaction to move with the same cold efficiency as the text my son had fired off to me that morning. Loretta is a force in the real estate world, and she doesn't make promises she can't keep. She told me she'd deliver an expedited escrow, and she did exactly that. Over the next 2 days, that quiet motel room overlooking Tampa Bay became a hub of digital signatures and encrypted portals. I sat at the small desk by the window, watching the water while I methodically dismantled my past. Emails arrived from the title company in rapid succession: title searches, wire transfer authorizations, seller disclosures. I read every document carefully, but my hand never slowed when it came time to click the signature line. I was signing over the deed of my family home to a faceless corporation. A few years back, the thought of bulldozers tearing through walls where I'd raised my son would have gutted me. Now it felt like clearing rubble from a building that had already fallen. It felt necessary. It felt like a cleansing fire. While I worked through the escrow paperwork, I kept thinking about where Derek and his wife were at that very moment, somewhere out on open water, completely sealed off from the reality bearing down on them back home. They had no idea that the ground beneath their lives was quite literally being sold out from under them. They thought they were untouchable. They assumed that when the vacation wrapped up, they'd stroll back key in the lock bags dropped in the hallway and pick up their rent-free existence right where they'd left it. It never occurred to them to check whose name was actually on the deed. They occupied the space, so in their minds, it was theirs by right. 72 hours. That's all it took to sever a lifetime of physical ties. On Friday morning, the final email arrived from the escrow company, the subject line reading simply, "Transaction funded and recorded." I opened it. The attached settlement statement confirmed the wire had gone through. I logged into my banking portal to verify. The account balance had climbed by a figure that took a moment to absorb. The money wasn't the point, but it was the last undeniable confirmation that it was done. Apex Development was now the sole legal owner of that property. The house was no longer mine. And more to the point, it was no longer my son's playground. Let me tell you what it feels like to sell your own history in 3 days. You expect a wave of grief to hit you. You expect the memories layered into those walls to reach out and make you doubt yourself. But when the betrayal comes from your own blood, and it goes that deep, the sentimental weight of wood and brick simply evaporates. I looked at the digital receipt on my screen and felt nothing but clean, uncluttered relief. I thought about the guest house where I had quietly confined myself so they could have the master suite. I thought about the main house where I wasn't permitted to have my own friends over because my presence interfered with the atmosphere his wife was cultivating. I had been covering the property taxes. I had been absorbing the maintenance costs. I had been paying the utility bills on a house I moved through like an intruder. The developers could knock it flat tomorrow. They could pull out every oak tree and pour concrete from fence line to fence line. I'd welcome it. I wanted every brick of their entitled sanctuary wiped from existence. I wanted the slate clean. Loretta called one final time to confirm the closing. She told me the Apex team was eager to take immediate possession. They had survey crews staged and ready to move in and secure the perimeter by Monday morning. I told her to hand them the keys at once. I let her know legally that the house was presently unoccupied, but that the previous unauthorized residents had left their personal belongings inside. Loretta, being the sharp operator she is, handled the legalities without a misstep. She formally notified Apex Development that the property was sold as is and that the new corporate owners held full legal authority to clear the premises however they saw fit. I authorized her to release the spare key I had pressed into her hand the day I drove away. The sun was going down over the water outside the motel window, throwing a deep orange wash across the room. The transaction was complete. The legal machinery had run its course without a single hitch. In under 3 days, I had converted a massive physical liability into liquid capital, cutting every legal and financial thread connecting me to my son and his wife. They were out on the water somewhere, drifting further from reality with every passing nautical mile. And I was sitting in a quiet, inexpensive room, drinking a cup of strong black espresso, feeling wealthier than I ever had in my life. Not because of the millions now sitting securely in my accounts, because I had finally reclaimed ownership of myself. I had taken my life back from people who had only ever seen me as a resource to be drawn down. I closed the laptop, slipped it into my leather bag, and got ready to move toward my final destination. The legal trap was set. The house was gone. All that remained was for the ship to come back to port. I knew precisely what was playing out at the cruise terminal, even from miles away. When you've spent 35 years pulling someone back from the edge, you learn their panic patterns by heart. I could picture the fluorescent glare of the boarding pavilion and the long queue of well-heeled travelers filing toward the gangway. And right there at the front of the VIP desk, my son was currently enduring a slow and very public unraveling. The ticketing agent would have run the credit card I had canceled and calmly informed him the balance was outstanding, $25,000. That is not a figure you explain away as a minor banking hiccup. That is a number that brings a conversation to a dead stop. Renee would have gone rigid in her designer sandals. Her parents, who had arrived expecting a frictionless luxury experience, would have looked at Derek with unmasked disgust. To people like them, there is no greater offense than appearing poor in front of witnesses. Derek had a choice in that excruciating moment. A man with backbone would have drawn his wife aside, owned the truth, and pulled the plug on the whole trip. He would have faced his in-laws, directly acknowledged that something had gone badly wrong, and walked away with whatever dignity remained. But Derek had no backbone. I had unknowingly taken it from him years ago by never letting him land. He was terrified of Renee and absolutely paralyzed by the prospect of her parents seeing through the facade he'd been maintaining. So, he did what a cornered man always does. He opened his wallet and started laying down plastic. I knew his finances better than he did. He kept 3 personal credit cards hidden from his wife, not the premium kind with high limits and concierge travel benefits. The predatory kind, the ones carrying 29% interest that you only reach for when every other option is gone. He would have slid the first card across to the agent with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The machine would approve maybe $10,000 before hitting the ceiling. The agent would hand it back and ask for another form of payment to cover the remaining balance. Derek would be sweating through his expensive linen shirt by now. He would surrender the second card. That one might absorb another $8,000 before hitting its ceiling. Then the third card would come out, the last drop of available credit to his name, just to clear the balance on the screen. I sat in my quiet room and turned over the sheer mathematical wreckage he had just engineered for himself. By splitting $25,000 across 3 maxed-out high-interest cards, he had personally arranged his own financial destruction. The interest alone would compound faster than he could ever chip away at it, and that crushing debt only got them through the terminal doors. It didn't touch the daily gratuities. It didn't cover the specialty dining Renee demanded every single night. It didn't account for the premium port excursions or the onboard spa treatments she had undoubtedly reserved in advance. He was stepping onto the gangway of a luxury ocean liner, but this was no vacation. He had just boarded a floating debtor's prison. Every time Renee ordered a premium cocktail by the pool, Derek was going to feel a physical constriction in his chest. Every time her parents gestured toward an expensive bottle of wine at dinner, he was going to tally how much closer he was edging toward total collapse. The luxury trip he had so desperately arranged without me had become a financial noose in the space of a single transaction. And he had tied the knot himself. As far as he knew, I had gone completely dark. He was probably unlocking his phone every 5 minutes, praying I would eventually unblock him and step in to fix things. He was probably firing messages into the void, swearing to pay me back, begging me to correct the bank error. He didn't know the number was blocked for good. He didn't know the house he expected to return to had already been signed over to a corporate developer. I poured myself a fresh cup of strong black espresso and watched the seagulls wheel and dive toward the water outside my window. There is a very particular kind of peace that settles in when you finally stop trying to manage the unmanageable. For years I had lain awake over his future. I had worn myself down worrying about his reckless spending and his bottomless need to impress people who felt nothing for him. I had tried to lay a solid foundation beneath him so he wouldn't have to fight the way his mother and I had fought. But you can't lay a solid foundation under someone who only wants to build a house of cards. The ship was probably sounding its departure horn right about now. The massive engines would be churning the dark water, swinging the vessel toward open ocean. Derek would be standing on a private balcony with a champagne glass, working hard to hold a smile for whoever was watching. Performing perfection. But beneath that held smile, he would be suffocating. Running the numbers in his head, calculating how to survive the next 10 days without anyone discovering he was flat broke. He had thrown his own father away for the sake of appearances. He had chosen the illusion of wealth over the reality of family. Now he was going to receive exactly what he had chosen. He was encircled by his hand-picked family on a ship built for royalty, and he was utterly, completely alone. The avalanche had started, and he was standing directly in its path. I took a slow sip and let the quiet morning settle around me. The debt was entirely his problem now. I was breathing free air for the first time in years. The drive down the coast ended exactly where it had always been heading. I left the main highway and followed the winding coastal road into a beachfront condominium, private gated community on St. Pete Beach. The security guard recognized my truck, gave a polite nod, and raised the barrier. I drove the palm-lined street to the underground parking garage beneath a sleek glass tower that looked out over the ocean. I parked my truck in my assigned spot and turned off the engine, sitting still for a moment. The quiet here was a different animal entirely. Not the tense, suffocating silence of the guest house, where I'd always felt like I was walking across broken glass. This was the deep, settled quiet of a sanctuary. I took my leather briefcase and my single suitcase and moved toward the private elevator. I swiped my keycard, the doors closed, and I rode directly to the top floor. When the elevator opened, I stepped into my own private foyer. I unlocked the front door and pushed it wide. Late afternoon light poured through the tall windows, falling across the clean hardwood floors and the spare, well-chosen furniture. Derek and Renee had no idea this place existed. No one did apart from my attorney Gordon and my broker Loretta. I had purchased this condominium 5 years ago, not long after I had handed the main house to my son. I had told myself that moving into the guest house was the honorable thing to do, giving the young couple room to build something of their own. But within 6 months, it was clear I hadn't given them a home. I had given them a stage. Renee set about redecorating with aggressive, expensive taste, discarding pieces of furniture my late wife Diane and I had chosen back when we were just starting out. I watched our history carried out to a dumpster to make room for imported finishes and velvet sofas. It broke something in me, but I kept quiet. Instead of fighting it, I took a measured slice of what Diane and I had built and bought this beachfront property outright in cash. I registered it under a blind trust. I told myself it was a portfolio investment, a way to diversify. But I knew what it really was. I was constructing a lifeboat because I could already see my son lashing himself to an anchor. I carried my suitcase into the master bedroom. The space was immaculate, a wide bed facing a private balcony above the breaking waves. I unpacked methodically, hanging shirts in the generous closet. I hadn't brought much. Decades of accumulated belongings were still sitting in the old property. The developers would probably push it all into a landfill by Tuesday, and I felt nothing about that. The things that actually mattered were not objects. They were peace of mind and the freedom to live without being held in contempt. Down the hall, the second bedroom had been fitted out as a home office. I set my leather briefcase on the polished desk, drew out the laptop, and connected it to the docking station. The dual monitors came to life. This was my command center. From this desk, I could track my investments, stay across the legal work Gordon was preparing, and watch the slow-motion collapse of the financial fiction my son had constructed. I opened my email and found a final confirmation from the escrow company. The wire transfer for the sale of the main house had fully cleared. Millions of dollars sat securely in my private accounts, entirely beyond the reach of anyone who shared my last name. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. I swung open the liquor cabinet and lifted out a bottle of aged single malt scotch I had been saving for a special occasion. Today was unquestionably a special occasion. I poured 2 fingers of the smoky amber spirit into a heavy crystal glass. I crossed the living room, slid the heavy glass doors open, and stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean breeze met my face, sharp clean, carrying the scent of salt and open space. The sun was beginning its descent, dropping toward the horizon, pulling the sky into deep shades of orange and purple. I leaned into the glass railing and drew a slow sip. The scotch burned warm and smooth, spreading through my chest, exactly right. I gazed out over the wide water. Somewhere beyond that horizon, hundreds of miles away, a massive luxury cruise ship was cutting through the night. My son was on that ship, drowning in predatory debt, surrounded by people who would drop him the instant his card stopped working, trapped inside a prison of his own construction. I took another sip and watched the sun slip beneath the waterline. The transition was complete. My new life had officially begun. The ocean stretched away in every direction, a vast field of deep sapphire blue. The luxury cruise liner pressed through the swells with enormous, unhurried power. Up on the top deck, a string trio played elegant drifting melodies, while waiters in crisp white uniforms moved among the lounging guests with silver trays of champagne. It was the absolute peak of vacation opulence. For the other 3,000 passengers aboard, this was paradise. For Derek, it was a floating prison cell. He stood at the railing, the warm Caribbean air brushing his face, yet he couldn't stop shaking. Not a single minute of sleep had come since the ship pulled away from the port of Tampa cruise terminal. Every time his eyelids fell, he saw that vivid red screen at the ticketing terminal, flashing declined. He had scraped together every last fragment of available credit he owned just to get his wife and her family on board. But that was only where the nightmare started. The ship ran entirely on a cashless system. Every cocktail, every specialty meal, every shore excursion went straight to the room, a folio tied to a card, sitting at exactly $14 of remaining credit. Renee had no idea how close to the edge they were. At that moment, she was somewhere inside the Grand Promenade, a sprawling indoor mall lined wall to wall with high-end designer boutiques. Derek stepped into the air-conditioned hall, his stomach twisting into something that felt like a fist. He spotted his wife in front of a brightly lit glass case inside a luxury jewelry store. Her mother was right beside her, one finger tapping the glass above a wide gold bangle set with channel diamonds. Her father lingered a few feet back, scrolling his phone with the vacant air of a man who had somewhere better to be. Derek pulled on a smile and crossed the room toward them. Renee turned eyes bright and pressed her fingertip to the glass above a pair of sapphire drop earrings framed by a halo of small diamonds. She asked him if he had ever seen anything so stunning in his life. Her mother offered the kind of smile that takes years of practice to perfect. She told Renee they were lovely and that a woman simply had to have the right accessories for the formal dinner that evening. A perfect boarding gift, she called it. The color drained out of Derek's face. He glanced at the discreet little price tag resting beside the velvet display box. $1.400. He opened his mouth to suggest browsing elsewhere, maybe to hold off until they reached the first port. But before he could string the words together, Renee had already pivoted toward the sales clerk. She announced brightly that they would take them. Her hand moved into her designer bag, found the room key card, and passed it across the glass counter. The clerk, a composed young man in a dark suit, slid it through the terminal. Derek held his breath. He prayed for a miracle. He prayed the ship systems were delayed in syncing with the bank. The terminal let out a sharp, flat beep. A small red light blinked on the screen. The clerk's brow creased slightly. He ran the card a second time. The machine beeped again. He dropped his voice to maintain discretion and apologized. The room folio, he explained, was requesting an alternative form of payment. The card on file had come back declined. Renee went still. Her perfectly manicured hand hung suspended in midair. Slowly she turned her head and looked at Derek. Her eyes were wide, first confusion, then something harder moving in behind it. Her mother exhaled softly, a sound that was anything but accidental, calibrated to drift across the quiet boutique. Derek swallowed. His mouth had gone bone dry. He managed to stammer that it was probably a fraud alert. He pulled out his wallet, told the clerk the bank always flags international travel, and said he'd just use his physical card. He knew it was maxed out. He handed it over anyway, half hoping the terminal itself was the problem. The clerk inserted the chip. The screen churned for 3 agonizing seconds and then threw up the same brutal word. Declined. A cold sweat surfaced on Derek's forehead. He asked the clerk, his voice catching slightly, to please try one more. He offered his emergency backup card, the one with the punishing interest rate. The clerk processed it. Declined. The hush inside the boutique had become suffocating. The clerk busied himself with a stack of receipts, eyes carefully averted. Renee's stare had turned to something close to venom. A deep flush was climbing up her face. Her mother stepped forward. With slow, deliberate hands, she opened her purse, drew out a heavy metal credit card, and set it quietly on the glass counter. She told the clerk to put the earrings on her account. Then she turned to Derek. Her voice was low, but each word landed with the weight of something thrown. She told him it was perfectly fine. Some men simply enjoy playing pretend. They were quite used to looking after their daughter, she said. Her father finally glanced up from his phone. Not a word. He simply looked at Derek, gave one slow shake of his head, and walked out of the store. Derek stood there unable to move. 35 years old, and he was being publicly undone by his in-laws while his wife watched without flinching. He had sacrificed his own father's trust just to buy himself a seat at this family's table, and right now they were looking at him the way you look at a stray that wandered in off the street. The evening only extended the humiliation. They were placed at a prime table in the specialty steakhouse. Crystal chandeliers caught the light overhead, and a string trio played elegant drifting melodies somewhere behind them. Derek sat, rigid eyes fixed on his plate, having barely spoken since the boutique. The father called for the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. When the waiter poured the first glass, the older man lifted it for a toast. To family, he said, and to men who understand what financial responsibility actually means. He held Derek's gaze and delivered it cleanly. A man who cannot provide is not a man at all, but merely a liability. Renee clinked her glass against her father's. She didn't so much as glance at Derek. The enormous dining room seemed to press inward from every side. Derek couldn't get air. He pushed his chair back sharply, the legs scraping a loud protest across the floor, muttered something about not feeling well, and walked, nearly ran out of the room. He didn't register the stares from the other tables. He just needed air. He found a quiet stretch of the outer promenade deck near the lifeboats. The night was absolute black. Ocean wind tore at his face. He leaned hard into the railing, pulling at breath that wouldn't come. Every option had closed. His credit was gone. His pride lay in pieces. His marriage was dissolving right before him. Then a thought cracked through all of it sudden as a lightning strike. The emergency account. Years back when Derek had just graduated from college, his father had opened a joint savings account in both their names. His father had put $50,000 into it and made one thing clear. It was to be touched only in the event of a genuine life-altering emergency. Derek had never once thought about it because there had never been a real emergency. His father had always just handled things directly. He pulled out his phone. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He connected to the ship's satellite internet, the kind that costs a small fortune per minute. He didn't care about the roaming charges. He just needed something to grab onto. He opened the banking app. The loading wheel turned slowly, indifferent to his desperation. He prayed in silence. All he needed was to move $10,000 into his checking account, enough to clear the cards and survive the rest of this wretched cruise. He told himself he'd apologize to his father afterward. He would grovel if that's what it took. The app's main dashboard finally resolved on screen. Derek scrolled down past his checking account, past 3 maxed-out credit cards hunting for the joint savings account. He scrolled back up. It was nowhere to be found. Panic seized him by the chest. He tapped through the closed accounts menu, certain it was some kind of display glitch. Nothing. He dialed the bank's 24-hour international support line and paced the wooden deck for 10 agonizing minutes of hold music before a representative finally picked up. Derek gave his account details and rushed through an explanation a joint savings account had vanished from his dashboard. The representative responded in a calm, measured tone, apologized for the confusion, and asked for a moment to look into it. A brief pause, the sound of keystrokes. She came back on the line and informed him that the joint savings account in question had been officially closed the previous morning. Derek's voice shot up as he demanded what she meant. He hadn't closed anything. The representative explained that the primary account holder, Walter Kavanaugh, had come into a branch in person and fully dissolved the joint status of the account. All funds had been legally withdrawn and the account was permanently closed. His name had been removed from the profile entirely. Derek stood motionless on the deck. The wind screamed around him, but all he could hear was the blood pounding in his ears. The representative asked if there was anything else she could help him with tonight. Derek's phone slipped from his grip and clattered against the wooden deck. He seized the metal railing with both hands and stared out into the dark, boundless ocean. The full weight of his situation came crashing down on him with devastating, bone-crushing force. His father hadn't simply frozen a credit card. His father had methodically and deliberately cut him out of his financial life entirely. There was no safety net left, no contingency. He was adrift in the middle of the ocean, flat broke and utterly alone. Monday morning came in with a clear blue sky and a sharp ocean breeze beyond my new window. I was at my mahogany desk, drawing a slow sip from a cup of strong black espresso, when my phone lit up with an incoming call. It was Loretta. She hadn't called to chat. She called to deliver the final word on the property. Apex Development had taken official possession of the lot at precisely 8:04 in the morning. I leaned back in my leather chair and listened while she walked me through the clean mechanics of corporate real estate. When Derek and Renee had first moved into the main house 3 years ago, I had drawn up a formal lease agreement. My intention was to give my son a real education in ownership and financial accountability. I offered them a rate well under half the going market value. When I put the paperwork in front of them, Renee was deeply offended. She dismissed the notion of paying a single dollar to live in a house she claimed would obviously be theirs someday. She told Derek that family doesn't charge family. She refused to put her name on a single page. That arrogant refusal turned out to be the finest gift she ever handed me. Because they never signed a lease and never paid a single utility bill, they had absolutely no tenant rights to stand on. In the eyes of the law, they were nothing more than temporary guests of the property owner, and that property owner was now a massive corporation, backed by a team of aggressive attorneys and a tight demolition schedule. Apex Development had no interest in eviction notices or grace periods. Time is money in their world. Loretta gave me a play-by-play of the morning's operation. A fleet of commercial vans rolled up to the curb. A crew of broad-shouldered men in neon safety vests walked straight to the front door. They brought heavy power tools and made short work of the brass locks I had installed 30 years ago. They swung the front doors wide and stepped their work boots onto the expensive imported rugs Renee had pressured Derek into buying. The foreman moved through each room with a clipboard assessing the clearing process. Apex had demolition permits queued and ready to file with the city. They wanted the structure leveled by month's end so they could break ground on a new luxury compound. But they couldn't bring in the wrecking ball while the house was still full of designer clothing and expensive espresso machines. The developer brought in a third-party commercial moving company to handle that problem. These were not the careful white-glove movers Renee would have chosen to handle her precious belongings. They were fast, efficient workers paid by the hour to empty a structure as quickly as possible. They arrived with hundreds of plain brown cardboard boxes and rolls of heavy packing tape. I sat in my quiet office and let the scene play out in my mind. Renee had spent 3 years meticulously shaping that house to resemble the cover of an architectural magazine. She had thrown out the wooden rocking chair where I used to read to Derek when he was small. She got rid of the custom dining table that my late wife Diane and I had purchased with our very first company dividend. She had replaced my family's history with fragile velvet sofas and cold glass surfaces. She treated that house like her own private museum. Now, her museum was being taken apart by men who had zero interest in her aesthetic. They grabbed her hundreds of expensive shoes and dropped them into boxes without bothering to match the pairs. They folded her designer dresses without a thought for the delicate silk. They wrapped her imported glass vases in thick industrial packing paper. They moved room by room, stripping the house to the studs. Every single item Derek had gone into predatory debt to buy her was being unceremoniously packed into uniform cardboard boxes and hauled into the back of a massive moving truck. The legal team at Apex was ruthless, but precisely calculated. They understood they couldn't simply dump the belongings on the street without inviting a nuisance lawsuit from a disgruntled former occupant. So, they chose the most sterile lawful solution available. They secured a medium-sized climate-controlled storage unit on the industrial side of town. The moving trucks transported every trace of my son and his wife's life to that concrete facility. The movers unloaded the boxes, stacking them high against the corrugated metal walls. They shoved the velvet sofa and the expensive espresso machines in side by side in a chaotic heap. When the last box was set down, the facility manager pulled the heavy metal door shut. The developer had prepaid the storage rental for exactly 30 days, fulfilling their narrow legal obligation to secure the abandoned property found inside their newly acquired structure. After 30 days, the storage facility would legally seize the unit and auction off the contents to recover any unpaid balances. The developer mailed the storage unit key and the transfer paperwork to the address on file, knowing full well the envelope would sit in an empty mailbox waiting for residents who no longer had a home there. Back at the property, the transition was final and absolute. The foreman walked the empty, echoing rooms to confirm the job was complete. He gave the signal to his exterior crew. They unrolled heavy chain-link construction fencing and wrapped it around the entire perimeter of the lot. They drove metal stakes deep into the manicured lawn Renee had paid expensive landscapers to keep pristine. They bolted thick commercial padlocks onto the front doors. Then they planted a massive wooden sign squarely in the center of the front yard. It carried the bold red and black logo of Apex Development alongside a blunt warning: active demolition zone, no trespassing violators prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Loretta told me the entire clearing operation had taken under 5 hours. By early afternoon, the house where I had lived for 3 decades was unrecognizable. It wasn't a home anymore. It was an empty shell waiting for the wrecking ball to reduce it to a foundation. I turned and looked out my new office window. The ocean lay calm out there today. A deep, settled sense of satisfaction took hold in my chest. Derek and Renee had sailed off on their luxury cruise, expecting to return to a rent-free sanctuary. They believed they had successfully pushed me out of the frame so they could go on living out their wealthy fantasy. What they hadn't grasped was that I had simply stepped back and let the real world arrive to meet them at full speed. And the real world was currently locked behind a cheap metal door in an industrial park storage facility with a 30-day timer counting down. I refilled my cup and settled by the wide windows of my new condo. My tablet rested on the glass coffee table. A fresh automated email had just landed in my inbox. The subject line was brief and clinical. It was a notification from the Luxury Auto Leasing Corporation, confirming that the recovery order had been successfully executed. I read the short paragraph and took a slow sip. The digital world is remarkably efficient when you stop funding it. 3 years ago, Derek had come to me begging for help securing a vehicle that matched his new image. He told me he needed a car that commanded respect. He wanted an imported black sport utility vehicle with custom leather interiors and a premium sound system, a car built entirely for appearances. The leasing company required a substantial down payment and a spotless credit history. Derek had neither. I co-signed the lease and set up the automatic monthly transfers out of my own checking account. It was one more brick in the false foundation I had constructed for him. When I canceled that automatic transfer on the morning of his cruise, the banking system responded with perfect precision. High-end leasing companies don't send courteous reminder letters when a payment bounces on a $100,000 asset. They rely on aggressive automated algorithms. The moment my primary financial guarantee was legally withdrawn, the system flagged the account as a critical default risk. The vehicle carried a hidden tracking device. The bank knew its exact coordinates at all times. They knew it was sitting idle at the port of Tampa. I could picture the massive parking structure at the cruise terminal without any effort. It's a towering concrete structure sitting right at the water's edge. The air out there always hangs thick with humidity and the smell of diesel. Derek would have parked on the ground level in the designated premium zone. He probably paid triple the daily rate just so Renee wouldn't have to wheel her designer luggage through an elevator. He left the car there convinced it was a secure vault, patiently holding his place until he returned. The bank dispatched a local recovery agency the instant the grace period ran out. Repossession professionals are highly skilled at what they do. They have no interest in family drama or luxury getaways. A digital bounty appears on their screen, and they go out and collect. The tow truck would have rumbled down the industrial access roads toward the port terminals, its heavy diesel engine reverberating off the concrete walls. Port Authority security is notoriously tight, but they don't argue with lawful court orders. The recovery agents would have pulled up to the security booth and handed over the bank authorizations. The guards would review the paperwork and cross-check the vehicle identification number on their clipboards. There would be no dramatic standoff. They would simply press a button, raise the heavy security gate, and wave the truck straight through to the premium parking level. The repossession itself is a masterpiece of modern mechanical efficiency. The tow truck would back in slowly toward the gleaming black vehicle. No alarm would sound in the quiet of the garage. The operator would use hydraulic controls to slide heavy steel arms directly beneath the front tires. The metal chains would clink softly as they locked the wheels in place. In under 3 minutes, the heavy imported vehicle would be lifted clean off the pavement, the whole operation looking almost effortless. I sat in my quiet living room and turned over the sheer irony of it all. Derek was miles out at sea at the very moment. He was probably slumped in a deck chair, already overwhelmed by a string of declined cards. He was stressing over expensive dinners and boutique charges Renee had run up, but somewhere beneath the panic, he likely clung to a thin sense of security. He told himself that no matter how bad things got on the ship, his status symbol was waiting for him on shore. He imagined stepping off that boat, dropping into his leather seat, and driving back to his rent-free house. He had no idea his status symbol was, at that moment, bouncing along on the back of a commercial tow truck. The driver would navigate out of the port district and head straight for the dusty impound lot on the eastern edge of Tampa. The vehicle would be dropped behind a tall chain-link fence crowned with coiled barbed wire. The leasing company would immediately begin calculating early terminations, penalties, late fees, and daily storage costs, piling thousands of additional dollars onto his already wrecked credit profile. I set the tablet face down and left it there. I felt no pull to call him or to warn him. He had made his position perfectly clear with that text message. He wanted to be the sole provider for his wife and her wealthy family. He wanted to project the image of a highly successful man who had no need for his father. I was simply letting him experience the full, unvarnished weight of the life he had chosen. The luxury car was gone. The family home had been sold and locked behind construction fencing. Every bank account was sealed. Each illusion of wealth he had assembled was being systematically reclaimed by the real world. He had sailed off on a luxury vacation to outrun his insecurities, and he was going to return to an absolute wasteland. I looked out at the rolling ocean and drew in a slow breath of clean salt air. I was finally done paying for a life that had never truly been mine. The modern luxury cruise ship is engineered to make you forget. The outside world exists a floating palace of indulgence where every desire is catered to. I knew Renee would seek out the onboard spa the moment the financial tension with her parents grew too heavy to sit with. Pampering had always been her coping mechanism. When things turned difficult, She retreated to places that smelled of eucalyptus and lavender. The ship featured a sprawling wellness center on the top deck, offering panoramic ocean views, hot stone massages, and holistic therapies. It was the perfect refuge for a woman who had no interest in facing the reality of her husband's financial collapse. She would have booked the most expensive package on the menu, a full day of rejuvenation, complete with sea salt, scrubs, facial treatments, and imported essential oils. Cost wouldn't concern her because she believed she held a golden ticket. 3 years ago, she had convinced Derek that she needed a premium concierge health and wellness insurance policy. It was a ridiculously expensive plan that covered elective luxury treatments, international spa retreats, and holistic care. Derek had come to me and begged me to cover the monthly premium. He said it was essential for her mental well-being. I paid that exorbitant bill every single month without a word of complaint. But I canceled that policy the exact same morning I canceled the car lease. When you cut a financial tie, insurance companies move with ruthless speed. There are no grace periods for elite wellness plans. The moment the payment stopped, the policy was instantly flagged as permanently terminated in the global database. I pictured Renee stepping out of the treatment room, wrapped in a plush white robe, loose and satisfied feeling, entirely superior to everyone else on the ship. She would glide up to the serene marble front desk to check out. The lighting would be low. Soft ambient ocean sounds would drift from hidden speakers. She would reach into her designer tote, pull out her premium concierge insurance card, and lay it across the counter. She would expect the receptionist to smile and process the claim without a single question. The card would be swiped. The system would reach out to the mainland servers, and then the warm smile would disappear. The receptionist would try the card a second time, assuming it was a simple magnetic read error. The system would return the same fatal answer. Policy terminated. No active coverage on file. The receptionist would quietly inform Renee that the card had been declined. Renee would bristle immediately. She does not handle rejection well, and she has a particular contempt for being told no by service staff. She would insist the card be run again. Her voice would climb slightly, cutting through the hushed, tranquil atmosphere of the spa. The spa manager would emerge from the back office to contain the situation before it escalated further. The manager would enter the policy number directly into the main system. Then she would look Renee in the eye and calmly explain that the primary account holder had canceled the coverage entirely. The plan simply no longer existed. The blood would rush to Renee's face. Panic and fury would crash together in her chest. The spa bill would easily clear $1,000. She couldn't charge it to the room folio. Derek had already exhausted every card, and the account was locked. She had no means to cover the treatment she had just received. The spa manager would politely but firmly hold her there until an alternative form of payment was provided. Renee had only one option left. She would have to swallow her considerable pride and ask the manager to call her parents. Her father was a man who despised public scenes above almost anything else. He had built his entire reputation on quiet, controlled wealth. Walking into the women's spa lobby to settle his daughter's unpaid bill would cut him deeply. He would arrive at the front desk with a face carved from stone. He would hand over his heavy metal credit card to clear the humiliating debt. He wouldn't address the spa staff. He would simply pay, then turn the full force of his cold, furious gaze on his daughter. Derek would arrive moments later, breathless and damp with sweat. Renee would have fired off a frantic, cutting text message ordering him to the spa immediately. The confrontation that followed would not be loud. Wealthy people don't raise their voices in public spaces. They use a low, controlled tone that goes straight for the bone. The boiling point had finally been reached. Her father would look at Derek the way you look at something that has soiled a valuable rug. He would demand to know why his daughter had been left stranded without basic wellness coverage. He would demand to know why Derek was failing at the most fundamental duties of a husband. He would ask Derek directly, what kind of man brings a woman on a luxury vacation without a single working credit card or an active insurance policy? Derek would stammer. He would try to lay the blame on a bank glitch. Now, before I tell you what was waiting for them when they got back and what it finally forced my son to face about himself, let me ask you this. If someone you loved and supported for years never once saw your worth, would you quietly walk away, or would you make sure they understood exactly what they were losing? He would try to spin some tale about corporate accounting errors, but the excuses would land like lead. Nobody believed a word out of his mouth anymore. The carefully maintained illusion of his success had been reduced to rubble. Then Renee would turn on him. When a marriage is built solely on the foundation of financial transactions, it shatters into pieces the second the funds dry up. Every scrap of manufactured affection she had shown him while he was burning through my money would vanish on the spot. She would look at him with nothing but raw, undiluted contempt. She would demand to know what he had done to destroy her life. She would accuse him of making a spectacle of her in front of the entire ship and dragging her parents through the humiliation with her. She would tell him he was a complete and total failure. This was the total blackout. Every last light in Derek's meticulously constructed world had been switched off by force. He was standing in the dark, ringed by the very people he had left me behind to impress. They were dismantling him now, piece by piece. He had spent years treating my financial support as if it were simply his by birthright. He took my money and purchased himself a seat at their table. Now the money was gone, and that seat was being ripped right out from under him. I sat on the balcony of my new beachfront condominium on St. Pete Beach, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. I drew in a long, slow breath of salt-heavy air. I felt no pity for him. I felt no pull to clean up his mess. For 35 years I had been his generator, keeping the whole operation lit and running. I had absorbed every cost, every indignity, every ounce of stress just to keep his lights on. But you cannot truly appreciate the light until you are made to sit in the absolute darkness. He made his choices. He chose his wife. He chose her family. Now he had to survive the total blackout entirely on his own. I finished my drink, slid the glass balcony door shut behind me, and went inside to sleep. The most peaceful sleep of my entire life. The 10-day cruise was officially over. I knew the precise schedule because I had been the one who booked the tickets in the first place. I settled at my new mahogany desk and pulled up the maritime tracking website on my laptop. The massive luxury liner had docked at the port of Tampa on a cruise terminal, right on schedule in the early morning hours. I pictured the thousands of passengers streaming happily out of the terminal. They would be sun-bronzed and cheerful, clutching souvenirs and swapping stories. But 4 of those passengers were walking off that ship directly into a living nightmare. I knew the disembarkation process inside and out. Under the old arrangement, I would have been the one standing at the passenger pickup curb. For years, I had served as their personal chauffeur. I would drag myself out of bed before dawn, point my truck toward the crowded port, and sit through the traffic just to spare Derek the cost of a cab. I would haul their heavy designer luggage into the truck bed, while Renee complained that the humidity was wrecking her hair. I would ask how the trip went and sit there listening to them brag about expensive dinners I was never invited to afford. That was the old reality. The new reality looked nothing like it. Derek and Renee were descending the metal gangway in total suffocating silence. The final stretch of their luxury vacation had been gutted by the financial blackout. They couldn't buy souvenirs. They couldn't tip the crew. They'd been confined to the free buffet, Renee glaring at him from the other side of the table, while the premium dining rooms carried on without them. Her parents had likely refused to acknowledge him altogether. They had expected a flawless experience, and my son had delivered nothing but public embarrassment. The tropical heat would slam into them the moment they stepped beyond the air-conditioned terminal doors. They would have to wrestle their own heavy bags through the packed customs line because Derek couldn't spare the change for a porter. He was sweating through his clothes. He was exhausted and terrified, but buried somewhere underneath all of that, he was still clinging to one final, fragile, false hope. He believed the worst was behind him. He figured that once they cleared those terminal doors, he could shake free of his judgmental in-laws. He told himself he just had to walk to the premium parking garage, unlock his gleaming black luxury vehicle, and drive back to his comfortable rent-free home. I pictured the 4 of them moving through the massive concrete parking structure. The air inside those garages is always thick with exhaust and the hollow echo of car alarms bouncing off the walls. Renee would be a few steps ahead of the group, wheeling her suitcase and voicing complaints about her aching feet. Her father would be checking his watch, eager to be rid of this miserable episode. Her mother would be pressing a silk scarf over her nose against the smell drifting in from the port. Derek would guide them toward the designated premium parking zone. He knew precisely where he had left the car. He had paid for the most coveted spot near the elevators, all for the sake of impressing his wife. He would reach into his pocket and fish out the electronic key fob. He would press the unlock button, braced for the familiar crisp chirp of his high-end vehicle. He expected to see the headlights pulse in the dim concrete structure, but there would be no sound. There would be no flashing lights. There would only be an empty rectangle of stained concrete. Derek would stop cold. He would stab the button on the key fob a second time, then a third. Panic would begin climbing up through his chest. He would scan the neighboring spots, convincing himself he had simply misjudged the row. He would drop his bags and start jogging up and down the aisles, desperately hunting for a gleaming black SUV that was absolutely nowhere to be found. Renee would cross her arms and demand to know what the holdup was. Her father would release a long, theatrical sigh. He would ask Derek if he was genuinely incapable of remembering where he parked a car. Derek would jog back to them, drenched in sweat. He would stammer that the car was gone. He would insist it had to have been stolen. He would pull out his phone with shaking hands and attempt to call the Port Authority's security office to file a stolen vehicle report. But the port's security officers don't investigate cars that were lawfully repossessed by major financial institutions. The guard on duty would ask for the license plate number, politely and without drama. He would enter it into the security database, then deliver the cold, hard truth to Derek's face. The car was not stolen. The leasing company sent a tow truck on the very first day of the cruise because the primary account holder canceled the financial guarantee. The vehicle had been legally seized. Derek would drop his phone. The color would drain completely from his face. He was standing in a grimy parking garage, surrounded by his furious wife and her profoundly disappointed parents. He had no car whatsoever. He had no functioning credit cards. He had no way to keep the truth buried any longer. The illusion was completely shattered. Renee would explode. She does not handle public humiliation with any grace, and having a luxury vehicle hauled away by a repo agent is the deepest social disgrace imaginable. She would scream at him right there between the concrete pillars. She would demand to know how he had let this happen. She would ask him point blank if he was flat broke. Her mother would gasp and press her hand to her mouth in theatrical shock. Her father would slowly shake his head, regarding my son with pure disgust. He would look at Derek and tell him he was a total and complete failure. They were stranded. They had a mountain of luggage and no means of leaving the port. Derek couldn't even summon a taxi because his accounts were frozen solid. He had to stand there absorbing every ounce of that humiliation, while his wealthy father-in-law calmly pulled out his own phone and ordered a premium rideshare. The port is notorious for brutal rideshare surge pricing. The numbers would be astronomical. The father-in-law would select a large luxury SUV to handle all the bags. He wouldn't so much as glance at Derek while he did it. He would treat my son as though he had simply ceased to exist. The big black vehicle would swing up to the curb a few minutes later. The driver would climb out to load the heavy luggage into the back. Derek would move to help, but the father-in-law would wave him off like an incompetent child. They would all fold themselves into the rear of the vehicle. The ride back toward the suburbs would stretch well over an hour. It would be the longest, most agonizing hour of my son's entire life. The silence inside that car would be absolutely suffocating. No one would speak a single word. Renee would stare out the window with her arms crossed, fuming with rage. Her parents would sit rigid in the middle row, radiating pure judgment and disappointment. Derek would be wedged into the very back row, eyes fixed on the floorboards. He would be running the math on how fast he could get inside his house and away from the world. He just wanted to push through his front door, sink into his velvet sofa, and start working out how to survive the wreckage of this financial disaster. He still believed there was a house waiting for him. He still thought he had a safe place to crawl into, tend his wounds, and come up with some kind of plan. He thought the worst moment of his day had already passed in that parking garage. He had no idea the universe was loading one final devastating punch. I closed the maritime tracking website on my laptop. I picked up my coffee mug and stepped out onto my private beachfront balcony. The morning air sat warm and heavy with salt. I watched the waves roll in against the shoreline in that slow, steady rhythm. A deep, settled peace moved through me. For decades I had run myself into the ground, trying to lay smooth pavement under my son's feet. I had traded my own comfort to make sure he never had to taste failure. Now, I was simply stepping aside and letting gravity do its work. The rideshare was moving down the highway at this very moment, carrying them closer and closer toward the neighborhood where my old house used to be a home. Derek was probably counting the miles, clawing for the moment he could escape those judging eyes. He was driving headlong into a brick wall and hadn't the faintest idea. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the morning sun settle on my face. I was completely free. Whatever came next belonged entirely to them. The luxury rideshare turned onto the familiar tree-lined street of the upscale suburban neighborhood in West Chase, Tampa. For the past hour, the silence inside that vehicle had been absolutely suffocating. The air conditioning ran quietly in the background, doing nothing whatsoever for the scorching tension between the passengers. Derek sat jammed into the back row, staring at the perforated leather of the headrest in front of him. His body was spent and his nerves were shredded. His stomach felt hollow and sick. All he wanted was to walk up his manicured driveway, push through his custom oak front door, and collapse onto his expensive velvet sofa. He wanted to disappear from his furious wife and her deeply judgmental parents. He told himself that no matter how catastrophic the cruise had turned out financially, the house was still his. He still had a physical fortress standing between him and the outside world. He convinced himself that tomorrow morning he would call his father and beg for forgiveness. He was sure his dad would step in and straighten everything out same as always. The black vehicle slowed as it rolled up to the address. The driver eased to the curb and dropped the car into park. Derek looked out through the tinted window, and his mind immediately refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The cognitive dissonance was absolutely paralyzing. He blinked twice, certain the driver had pulled up to the wrong property. He checked the neighboring houses to get his bearings. But the massive oak tree anchoring the front yard was unmistakably the same. The street number painted on the curb was identical. Everything else was unrecognizable. The immaculate lawn where Renee had thrown outdoor brunch parties was completely gone. The green grass had been chewed up by heavy work boots and the aggressive treads of commercial demolition equipment. A towering silver chain-link fence encircled the entire property. It stood at least 8 feet high, a cold metal barrier between the public sidewalk and whatever remained of the structure behind it. Thick industrial brackets bolted the sections together, and heavy concrete blocks reinforced the base. Planted squarely in the center of the torn-up yard, driven deep into the ravaged earth, stood a large red and white wooden sign. Bold black lettering declared the site the exclusive property of Apex Development. Below the corporate logo, a stern warning identified it as an active demolition zone and made clear that trespassers would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The rideshare driver climbed out, moved to the trunk, and popped the rear hatch. He started pulling the heavy designer bags out onto the sidewalk, working quickly, and without comment utterly indifferent to the towering fence and the chaos unfolding around him. He had no interest in asking questions. He wanted his fare, and he wanted out of the toxic atmosphere radiating from these passengers. Renee stepped out of the car. She pushed her expensive sunglasses up and looked at the property. She went completely still. The carefully constructed reality she had been living in was coming apart in front of her eyes. Her mother and father followed her out a step behind. The father took one look at the construction fence and the corporate development sign. He exhaled slowly, a long breath soaked in pure disgust. He looked at the property and then turned to regard Derek the way a man looks at something he has stepped on. Derek stumbled out of the back seat. The midday sun pressed down on his shoulders, but he felt frozen through. His legs were trembling so badly he could barely keep upright. He walked to the chain-link fence and closed both hands around the warm metal links. He stared through them at the front porch. The custom oak doors were still there, but thick steel chains had been looped around them. A heavy industrial padlock cinched the chains, tight holding everything shut. Renee turned to face Derek, her expression twisted into something beyond fury, past the point where dignity or composure had any meaning. She didn't lower her voice for the neighbors. She didn't care who was watching from behind their curtains. She let loose a scream that carried the full length of that quiet suburban street. She demanded to know what was going on. She jabbed a perfectly manicured finger at the demolition sign and asked what he had done to her house. She wanted to know if he had quietly sold it to cover his mountain of hidden debt. She asked him point-blank whether they were homeless. Derek stammered and couldn't stop. He shook his head and stumbled backwards, swallowed by panic. He told her he had no idea what any of this was. He insisted there had to be some massive legal error. He swore his father owned the property and would never in a million years allow some corporate developer to lock them out. He pleaded with her to give him 5 minutes to get to the bottom of it. Her father pulled his arms across his chest. He fixed Derek with a cold, predatory stare. He told my son he was a liar and a complete failure. He said that men who actually succeed don't come home from luxury vacations to find their homes barricaded by commercial demolition firms. He told Renee to collect her bags because he was arranging another private car back to his estate. He made it explicitly clear that Derek was not welcome under any circumstances. Renee agreed without a moment's hesitation. She looked at Derek and told him his very existence disgusted her. She told him he had wrecked her life and embarrassed her in front of her family for the absolute last time. Then she turned her back on him and began hauling her suitcase down the sidewalk toward her parents. Derek was losing his grip on reality entirely. He stood watching his wife and her wealthy parents preparing to leave him planted on the side of the road. He looked back at the house that had propped up his entire false identity. His breathing went ragged and shallow. He was in the middle of a complete psychological breakdown on a public sidewalk in broad daylight. He lunged toward the heavy metal gate at the foot of the driveway. He seized the latch and wrenched it back and forth. It held fast-bound with a thick chain and a combination lock. Derek had stopped caring about logic or laws. He needed to get inside. He scaled the chain-link fence, his expensive resort clothes, snagging and tearing on the sharp wire edges as he went. He hauled himself over the top and dropped hard onto the dead grass below, scraping his palms on the dirt. He broke into a sprint up the concrete walkway toward the front porch. He dug into his pocket and pulled out his brass house key. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He reached the custom oak doors and tried to seat the key in the lock. The lock was gone. The developers had drilled straight through the cylinder, leaving nothing behind but a ragged hole in the wood. The heavy steel chains lashed around the door handles kept them from moving so much as a fraction of an inch. Derek let out a raw, guttural cry of pure desperation. He grabbed the thick industrial padlock binding the chains and threw his full weight against it. The heavy metal didn't move. He spun around in a wild search for any kind of solution. He spotted a heavy chunk of landscaping coral resting in the dry garden bed next to the porch. He bent down and lifted it, feeling its weight settle into his hands. He hoisted the coral chunk above his head and drove it down hard against the industrial padlock. The sharp crack of stone meeting steel rang out across the empty yard. He struck it a second time, then a third. Blind panic had swallowed him whole. He was trying to smash his way into a house he had never truly owned, convinced that if he could just get through that door, he could prove to Renee that everything was fine. What Derek did not know was that corporate developers do not leave multi-million-dollar assets sitting unguarded. The moment Apex Development took possession of the property, they had wired it with a state-of-the-art wireless security system. Built to deter vandals and metal thieves, it was highly sensitive and routed directly to a private security dispatch center. No loud sirens. No strobing lights to tip him off. The neighborhood stayed perfectly quiet, but the instant that heavy chunk of coral connected with the padlock vibration and sensors mounted inside the doorframe triggered a silent alarm. A digital distress signal fired immediately to the central security hub, confirming an unauthorized perimeter breach. Within seconds, the dispatcher had verified it and was on the line with the local police department. 2 patrol units were rolling toward the address before Derek had even raised the rock a 4th time. He kept hammering away at the unyielding padlock, completely blind to the silent countdown he had set in motion. His hands were raw and blistering, his expensive resort shirt soaked through with sweat and hanging off him in tears. The padlock didn't budge. He finally dropped the coral and sank to his knees on the concrete porch, pressing his forehead against the cold steel chains and weeping without restraint. Renee and her parents stood on the far side of the fence and watched him come apart. Not one word of comfort passed between them. They observed him with cold detachment like spectators watching a stranger unravel and said nothing. The second luxury rideshare they had called pulled up to the curb a few minutes later. They loaded their designer bags into the trunk without a backward glance. Renee stepped into the back seat and pulled the door shut. The car rolled smoothly down the street, taking with it the woman Derek had traded his own father to satisfy. He was left completely alone, kneeling on the porch of a padlocked house inside a chain-link fence. He had nothing left, and somewhere in the warm afternoon air, the faint wail of approaching police sirens was already growing louder. That sound cut through the quiet neighborhood like a blade shredding whatever thin illusion of control Derek had been holding on to. 2 patrol cruisers swung onto the street, their red and blue lights strobing hard against the well-kept lawns of the surrounding houses. A black private security vehicle from Apex Development rolled in right behind them and pulled to the curb directly in front of the fence. Derek stayed on his knees on the concrete porch, sweat pouring off him, his hands bleeding from the repeated blows against the padlock. He let go of the coral when the first officer stepped out of his cruiser. A wave of misplaced relief moved through him. He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and pushed himself to his feet. In his own mind, he was the injured party. He truly believed he was a homeowner whose property had been illegally barricaded by a rogue corporate developer. He was certain the police had come to rescue him, to cut those chains and hand his life back. The two officers approached the fence, and they did not look like rescuers. Their hands rested near their duty belts, and their faces were tight, professional, unreadable. The private security guard climbed out of the black vehicle behind them, holding a thick yellow envelope and a tablet. He positioned himself just behind the officers and watched Derek with flat, cold eyes. The lead officer, tall hair gone gray at the temples, spoke first. He told Derek to step away from the front door and walk toward the fence. It wasn't a suggestion. Derek obeyed immediately. He stumbled down the concrete walkway, his resort clothes shredded and caked with dirt. He grabbed the chain link with both hands. His voice came out high and frantic. He told the officers there had been a colossal mistake, jabbed a finger at the Apex Development sign, and demanded they cut the padlock off right now. He stated with absolute confidence that this was his house, that he lived here with his wife, and that some corporate entity had illegally locked them out while they were on vacation. The lead officer didn't move to match Derek's energy. He drew a small notepad from his chest pocket and asked for Derek's full legal name and identification. Derek patted his pockets before realizing his wallet was buried inside the luggage Renee had taken with her in the rideshare. He stammered out his name, Derek Kavanaugh. He gestured frantically toward the back of the property, telling the officers that his elderly father, Walter Kavanaugh, was living in the guest house out back. He insisted that if they just walked around the fence and knocked on the guest house door, his father would sort out the whole ridiculous misunderstanding. The Apex security guard stepped forward. He did not look at Derek. He placed his electronic tablet directly into the lead officer's hands and stated clearly and professionally that the property was a secured demolition site legally owned by his employer. He explained that the silent alarm had registered an unauthorized breach of the perimeter. The officer studied the tablet, tapping through the digital documents methodically. Then he lifted his eyes back to Derek. His expression had moved past cautious and landed somewhere colder. He told Derek that the property deed on record showed Apex Development as the sole legal owner of the lot and every structure on it. Derek shook his head hard. He tightened his grip on the chain link until his knuckles whitened. He said it was impossible. He repeated that his father owned the house. He raised his voice, demanding they go check the guest house right now, swearing his father was back there. The security guard spoke again. His voice sliced through Derek's panic with surgical precision. He informed the officers that the previous owner, Walter Kavanaugh, had executed a clean cash sale 72 hours ago. The property had been legally vacated, the transaction fully complete. He added that the guest house was empty. Derek froze. The air seemed to leave his body entirely. Those words landed like a physical impact. A clean cash sale, 72 hours ago, the exact span of that miserable cruise. He stared at the officer, eyes desperate, hunting for any crack in the wall. He argued that, even if his father had sold the house, he still had rights. He raised his voice. He was a legal tenant. He lived there for 3 years. They couldn't simply throw him out without a formal eviction notice. He demanded his 30 days. The officer glanced back at the tablet, then at the security guard. The guard extended the yellow envelope. He explained that the corporate legal team had fully vetted the occupancy status before closing. The officer pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope and read it quietly. Then he looked Derek directly in the eye. He explained that, because Derek had never signed a formal lease agreement and had never paid a single dollar in rent or utilities, he held no legal classification as a tenant under state law. He was classified as a guest of the previous owner. When the previous owner sold the property, those guest privileges were instantly and permanently revoked. The reality of it finally punched through the wall Derek had built around himself. He had refused to sign the lease 3 years ago because Renee had convinced him it was beneath him. He had refused to pay rent because he felt entitled to the space. His arrogance, the very quality he had mistaken for armor, had stripped away every legal protection he might have had. He released the fence and staggered backward. He took in the torn-up lawn, the massive corporate sign, the heavy steel chains across the front door. The house wasn't stolen from him. It was sold out from under him by the very man he had discarded just days before. The officer folded the sheet and slid it back into the envelope. He leveled a firm finger at Derek. He told my son that he was currently trespassing on private commercial property, that he had illegally scaled a security fence and triggered a silent alarm. He stated that the corporate owners had every right to pursue criminal charges for breaking and entering. Derek raised both hands in surrender, utterly and completely broken. He looked at the officers with eyes swimming in tears of pure panic. He asked them what he was supposed to do. He said he had no car, no money, and nowhere to go. He pleaded with them for help. The lead officer offered no sympathy. He pointed toward the street and told Derek to climb back over the fence the same way he'd come in. He had exactly 60 seconds to vacate the premises before he'd be put in handcuffs and taken to the county jail for criminal trespassing. Derek didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply turned, grabbed the cold metal links of the fence, and hauled himself up. The jagged wire edges caught his torn resort clothes, again ripping the fabric further. He dropped hard onto the public sidewalk, landing on both knees. He stayed there a moment, staring down at the concrete, every last shred of pride, wealth, and false identity gone. The officers kept their eyes on him, hands resting near their duty belts, making sure the trespasser was fully off the private commercial property. The patrol cruisers pulled away from the curb sirens off, but the message absolute. The dust settled in the street. The afternoon heat bore down like something solid. Derek stayed there on the public sidewalk, staring at the massive chain-link fence that stood between him and the house he thought he owned. His hands were scraped raw and bleeding. His expensive resort wear was dark with dirt and sweat. He was entirely alone. The private security guard from Apex Development was still standing on the other side of the fence, a professional employed by a massive corporation to protect a multi-million-dollar asset. The drama that had played out meant nothing to him. He didn't care that Derek's wife had walked away, or that Derek had nothing left to his name. The guard had one remaining task before he could climb back into his air-conditioned vehicle and wrap up his shift. He crossed to the heavy padlocked gate, reached into the chest pocket of his black tactical vest, and produced a thick yellow manila envelope. It looked similar to the one he'd handed the police officer, but heavier. Derek's full name was printed across the front in bold black marker. The guard said nothing. No sympathy, no explanation. He simply fed the envelope through a small gap in the chain link and let it drop onto the concrete sidewalk at Derek's feet. Then he turned and walked back toward the empty house. Derek stared at the yellow envelope. It sat there like a device waiting to go off. He reached down slowly and picked it up. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely tear through the heavy paper. He worked his fingers inside and drew out the contents. The first thing to drop out was a single silver key. It struck the concrete with a sharp metallic clink. Not a house key, not a car key. A cheap generic padlock key on a plastic tag with a number written on it. Unit 412. The second item was a stack of legal documents held together with a staple. The letterhead belonged to the commercial storage facility out in the industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Derek unfolded the pages and read through the cold, clinical language. The document was a formal notice from Apex Development's legal department. It stated that all personal property found inside the acquired structure had been boxed up and transported by a commercial moving company. The corporation had secured a medium-sized climate-controlled storage unit to house the abandoned belongings. Derek reached the next paragraph and felt whatever air remained in his lungs leave him. The corporate developer had prepaid the storage rental fee for exactly 30 calendar days. The clock had started the moment escrow closed. The document made clear that Apex Development was releasing all liability for the property. The final paragraph laid out the storage facility's strict policies. If the new key holder failed to assume the account balance before the 30-day deadline, the facility would legally seize the unit. The contents would go into a blind auction and be sold to cover the unpaid balance. Derek stared at the silver key sitting on the hot concrete. His entire life was locked inside a metal box in a dusty industrial park. Every velvet sofa Renee had demanded, all her designer dresses and imported shoes, the expensive espresso machines, the custom artwork. The entire carefully assembled aesthetic that had defined their marriage was currently stacked against a corrugated metal wall. He had exactly 30 days to work out how to cover the monthly rental fee on a commercial storage unit, and he didn't even have enough money to buy a bottle of water. His credit cards were maxed, his bank accounts frozen. His luxury vehicle was sitting in the impound lot on the eastern edge of Tampa, accumulating daily fees. The full weight of it finally broke through the last wall of his denial. He looked at that key and understood this was his inheritance. This was the return on years of treating me like an inexhaustible resource. I had spent 35 years laying the road beneath his feet, handing him everything he needed to build something real. When he wanted a bigger house, I moved into the guest house. When he wanted a luxury car, I co-signed the lease. When he needed to dazzle his wealthy in-laws, I paid for the VIP cruise, and he repaid me by discarding me like something disposable. He wanted me out of his life so he could play the role of the self-made provider. I simply gave him what he asked for. I stepped out of the frame and let the real world take it from there. I was sitting on the balcony of my beachfront condominium on St. Pete Beach, coffee mug in hand. The sun lay warm across my shoulders, and the ocean glittered out to the horizon. I thought about that yellow envelope and the single silver key. I thought about the corporate developers, the repossession agents, the aggressive credit card companies. None of them were villains. They were gears in the vast machine of reality. They run on cold, hard math. Stop feeding them money, and they stop maintaining the illusion of success. Derek had spent his entire adult life building a house of cards on a table that belonged to me. He believed he was the architect of something solid. What he never understood was that I was the only thing standing between him and the wind. Now he had to gather the pieces entirely on his own. He was sitting on a hot sidewalk, clutching a key to a box full of things he couldn't afford to keep. No car, no money, no wife. He had to work out how to get through the next 30 days without a single lifeline. Find a job, find somewhere to sleep, find a way to pay those storage fees before everything he owned disappeared into a blind auction. I finished my coffee and got to my feet. I walked back inside my quiet, immaculate condo. My phone sat on the desk completely silent. I had no plans to call him, no plans to pull him out. The lesson had been delivered in full and the correction was complete. I was a free man. Gordon Fitch runs his law firm from the 38th floor of a downtown high-rise. It is a space engineered to intimidate. The floors are polished travertine, and the walls are clad in dark, rich mahogany. The air conditioning is dialed to a crisp, sharp coolness that keeps everyone in the room alert. Gordon deals exclusively in facts and airtight contracts. He has no interest in family drama or emotional scenes. I had kept him on retainer for decades because he operates with the same clinical precision as a seasoned surgeon. He phoned me late that afternoon to walk me through the meeting. His account was so exact I could see the whole confrontation playing out in my mind. Derek had somehow talked Renee into meeting him at the firm. Greed is a remarkably reliable motivator. After leaving him stranded at the demolished property, she had probably gotten a frantic call from him while he was still on that sidewalk. He'd likely dangled the idea that my attorney was holding millions of dollars in a trust account from the house sale, convinced her they were legally entitled to half of it, that one credible threat of legal action would produce a check. Derek sold her the illusion because it was all he had left. Renee had always been easy to blind with the promise of money she hadn't earned. She forced her parents to drive her to the downtown financial district for one last attempt at a massive payday. They rode the polished steel elevator up to the 38th floor in tense silence. They pushed through the heavy glass doors of the reception area as though they owned the entire building. Derek was still in his filthy, shredded vacation clothes, looking unraveled and desperate. Renee walked a half step ahead of him, radiating cold, arrogant fury. She smoothed down her designer resort dress and walked straight past the receptionist without so much as a glance. She demanded to see Gordon immediately. She threatened to call the police and launch a massive lawsuit if they were denied immediate access to the firm's managing partner. Gordon had been expecting them. I had warned him they'd come looking for blood the instant they realized the house was gone. He stepped out of his corner office and calmly walked them into his primary conference room. The room is enormous and hushed, anchored by a sweeping custom glass table that mirrors the sprawling city skyline beyond the windows. Gordon offered them sparkling water. They declined. They were practically trembling with aggressive panic and raw entitlement. Hospitality was not what they'd come for. What they wanted was money. Derek drove both his scraped hands down onto the glass table. He demanded to know where I was hiding. He shouted that I had lost my mind and illegally sold a property that was rightfully his. He claimed that he and Renee had built marital equity in the house across the past 3 years, and that what I'd done amounted to criminal eviction. He ranted about the ruined luxury cruise, the canceled credit cards, and the towed vehicle. He cast himself as an innocent victim of a sudden cruel financial assault, carried out by a senile old man. Renee jumped in immediately. She raised her voice and tried to bully Gordon the same way she bullied retail clerks and spa receptionists. She declared that they had endured severe emotional distress and extreme public humiliation. She demanded immediate access to the proceeds from the real estate transaction. She told Gordon her wealthy father kept powerful high-priced attorneys on retainer. She promised they were fully prepared to tie up my estate in punishing litigation for decades if they weren't handed their rightful half of the money right then and there. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once in her life heard the word no. Gordon did not interrupt them. He did not raise his voice to match their hysterical volume. He sat perfectly still in his high-backed leather chair, hands resting quietly in his lap. He let them wear themselves out. He allowed them to empty every last threat, every last demand, and every last desperate lie into that room until the silence became total. Only the sound of Derek's heavy, ragged breathing filled the air. When they finally finished their performance, Gordon leaned forward and settled his arms on the cool glass surface. He looked directly at Derek, with eyes entirely free of sympathy or hesitation. He spoke in a low, measured tone that carried the full weight of legal authority. He informed my son that they had exactly zero legal standing in the state court system. He stated that the property had belonged solely to Walter Kavanaugh, and that as non-paying guests they held no tenant rights, no established equity, and absolutely no legal claim to a single penny of the multi-million-dollar sale. Gordon then turned his gaze to Renee. He politely suggested she call her father's powerful attorneys right now. He offered to put the call on speakerphone so he could personally walk them through the definition of a fee-simple cash transaction. Renee closed her mouth and swallowed hard. The sheer confidence in Gordon's voice rattled her deeply. Derek turned a dark shade of red. Whatever composure he'd been holding on to collapsed entirely. He yelled that he was my only son and my sole legal heir. He insisted that the house was his rightful inheritance, and that I had no business liquidating his future without his explicit permission. He jabbed a shaking finger at Gordon and demanded a check. He argued that family law protected both his right to the property and his right to maintain his standard of living. Gordon did not flinch. He reached slowly down beside his chair and lifted a massive, heavy, leather-bound binder. It was several inches thick, packed tight with hundreds of pages of printed financial documents. He raised it with both hands and set it squarely in the center of the glass table. The heavy thud of leather striking glass rang out sharply in that quiet room, making both Derek and Renee flinch. Gordon looked at the rattled couple. He told Derek that inheritance is a privilege extended by the estate holder, not a legal obligation imposed by the government. He laid his flat palm on top of the thick binder. He told them they were demanding their half of the money to cover their perceived losses. He explained that what sat inside that binder was the precise mathematical response to every aggressive demand they had just made. Renee stared at it. Her combative posture began to crumble. She glanced at Gordon, then at Derek. The certainty she had walked in with was dissolving into deep, unsettled confusion. She had anticipated a simple negotiation. She had expected to bully a settlement out of a timid old man through his corporate proxy. She had not anticipated a cold, methodical attorney arriving with a physical mountain of documentation. Derek stared at the binder as though it were a coiled snake about to strike. The anger drained clean out of his face, leaving nothing behind but raw terror. He knew somewhere deep down what that binder represented. He knew that for the past 5 years, he had been living entirely on false pretenses, but he had never seen the total sum of his dependency printed out and formally bound in leather. Gordon explained that I had anticipated their legal threats the moment I set the sale of the house in motion. I had spent the preceding 2 days meticulously compiling financial records alongside the legal team. He informed them that the binder on the table was not a settlement offer. It was not a negotiation tactic or a jumping-off point for mediation. It was a comprehensive ledger of absolute reality. It was the final accounting of an enormous investment that had produced zero return. The trap had closed completely, and they were sitting squarely in the middle of it, with no way out. Gordon slowly opened the thick leather cover of the binder. The sound of the heavy metal rings echoing in the silent conference room felt like a judge banging a gavel. He did not look at Derek or Renee with anger or malice. He regarded them the way an auditor regards a profoundly flawed spreadsheet. He turned to the first page. It was a summary document printed on heavy cardstock. Gordon began to speak in a measured, rhythmic tone that left absolutely no room for interruption or argument. He explained that 5 years ago, when Walter and his late wife Diane finalized the sale of their regional logistics empire, they had established a discrete operational budget designed to serve as a temporary safety net for their only son. The goal was to give Derek financial stability, while he built his own career and forged his own legacy. Gordon turned to the second section of the binder. The thick pages turned with a heavy rustle. He stated that the safety net was never meant to become a permanent hammock propping up a lifestyle of aggressive, unearned luxury. Gordon began reading directly from the itemized ledgers. He started with automotive expenses. He detailed the substantial initial down payment on the imported black sport utility vehicle. He read aloud the exact monthly lease transfers that had been automatically deducted from Walter's private checking account across the past 36 months. He moved on to insurance premiums, laying out the exorbitant monthly cost of the premium concierge health and wellness policy Renee had demanded. Renee sat rigidly in her leather chair. The color drained from her face as Gordon continued reading. He was stripping away the illusion of her perfectly curated life, layer by layer, in a cold, sterile room. She had always believed Derek was an elite earner. She had bragged to her country club friends about his financial prowess. Now, a stranger in a dark suit was itemizing her daily comforts and proving one line at a time that they had been paid for by an old man she had considered unworthy of joining her on vacation. Gordon flipped to a section marked with a red tab. He moved into the secondary expenses. He read off the monthly totals for high-end organic grocery delivery services that kept their pantry loaded with imported goods. He detailed the thousands of dollars spent on professional landscaping crews who maintained the pristine lawn of the main house, so Renee would never need to lift a finger. He listed the property taxes, the steep utility bills, and the structural maintenance costs they had completely ignored. He read out the dates and amounts of 4 separate large-scale credit card bailouts where Walter had quietly cleared Derek's predatory debts to keep his credit score from total ruin. Derek gripped the edge of the glass table. He felt exposed naked and completely humiliated. His entire false identity was being mathematically dismantled in front of the woman he had spent the last 3 years desperately trying to impress. He tried to speak to offer some excuse or justification, but Gordon simply raised a single flat hand, commanding absolute silence. Gordon turned to the final section of the binder. Gordon made one thing clear. Walter hadn't been writing checks without keeping score. Every transfer, every bailout, every indulgence had been logged with the same disciplined precision Walter once applied to running a regional corporate empire. He knew exactly what Derek was costing him, right down to the last cent. Gordon reached into the back of the binder and freed a single sheet of paper. He pushed it across the glass until it sat squarely in front of Derek and Renee, a final itemized invoice. He told them to read the figure printed in bold at the bottom. It was not a modest number. It was a staggering astronomical sum, the full accounting of 5 years of pure unadulterated financial parasitism. Gordon explained that the figure on that page was the precise total Walter had channeled into their lives. That was the amount they had treated as their birthright, while at the same time dismissing the man, bankrolling it all as a nuisance to be stashed in the guest house. Renee's eyes fixed on the paper. Her hands had begun to shake. 3 years she had spent looking down at her father-in-law. She'd rolled her eyes at his modest wardrobe and his unhurried way of living. She'd told her well-heeled parents that Derek was a high-powered executive who gave her everything she wanted. Now the invoice in front of her tore that story apart. Her husband wasn't a provider. He was a grown man drawing a stipend, and she had helped him bite down on the very hand that kept them both fed. The dread that hit her next was physical. Her parents were going to learn every bit of this. The embarrassment would be complete, total, irreversible. Derek couldn't bring himself to glance at the number at all. His eyes dropped to his own banged-up hands. His mind pulled back to the cold concrete he'd been deposited on just hours before. He tried a different angle. Since his father was a multimillionaire, he muttered a number like that was meaningless. He scrambled back to his only remaining argument. He yelled that he was still the sole legal heir. He claimed that this invoice was irrelevant because one day the entire estate would naturally pass to him anyway. He wanted to know where his inheritance stood, certain that being Walter's son was an ironclad guarantee no matter how badly he had behaved. Gordon brought the heavy leather binder shut with a firm, decisive snap. Hands folded on top of it, he turned his gaze to Derek and held it there. He told my son plainly that biology is not a claim on wealth that was never earned. Gordon then laid out what had taken place early that morning. He had formally filed and executed a sweeping restructuring of Walter's entire estate. The millions that flowed from the logistics empire sale and the recent property transaction had been moved permanently into an ironclad, irrevocable, charitable trust. The air left Derek's lungs. His eyes stretched wide. He asked what irrevocable actually meant in this context. The question came out barely above a breath. Gordon answered it without softening a single syllable. Walter Kavanaugh had disinherited him completely deliberately, and with the full force of the law. The trust named Derek as a biological relative for the explicit purpose of locking him out, not a single penny to his name from the estate. Gordon noted that the language had been engineered by a team of elite estate attorneys specifically to hold up against any future legal assault. There was no argument of oversight, no angle of mental incompetency to exploit. That money was beyond Derek's reach, forever earmarked for educational charities and local community development grants. Gordon surveyed the two of them. He said Walter had made up his mind to stop underwriting a fiction. The invoice wasn't a bill to be paid. Walter had no illusions about them producing funds they didn't have. It was something else entirely. It was a receipt marking the close of that chapter. Derek sat frozen in the conference chair, unable to move or speak. The full weight of what he'd done settled over him like a structure giving way. He had swapped a multi-million-dollar inheritance for one tropical cruise and the brief approval of a woman who was now staring at him with open contempt. He had surrendered every safety net he'd ever had because he couldn't be bothered to see the worth in the quiet old man out in his guest house. And now he was about to walk out of this building into a life with no money, no roof over his head, and no father willing to pull him back from the edge. Gordon pushed back his chair and stood. He tugged his jacket straight and told them the meeting was done. No legal standing, no financial claims, no grounds to reach out to Walter Kavanaugh or this firm ever again. He suggested politely, but with absolute clarity, that they leave before he picked up the phone and had security remove them from the building. Not a sound in that room. The lawsuit threats had evaporated. Renee's bluster about high-powered attorneys had gone silent. All that remained was the suffocating, merciless weight of a reckoning fully arrived. Derek's gaze fell to the invoice still lying on the table. He grasped for the first time what his choices had actually cost him. Every last thing. The conference room's glass doors swung closed behind them with a low, definitive thud. Derek and Renee emerged into the wide lobby of the law firm, the tile gleaming under cold, fluorescent light. The air conditioning bit hard, yet Derek was damp with sweat beneath his wrecked resort shirt. The ground beneath him felt unstable. He'd come up here braced for a confrontation, angling for a check. He was leaving with nothing at all. Renee didn't spare him a backward glance. She moved in a straight line across the lobby floor, each heel strike ringing out against the polished stone. Her parents had been camped on a leather sofa beside the elevators, fully expecting the windfall their daughter had all but promised them. Her father had one eye on his phone, waiting to see Derek walk out with paperwork and a number. What he got instead was his daughter shaking with a fury so dense and focused it seemed to pull the warmth from the air around her. Her mother was on her feet before a word was spoken, reading the atmosphere instantly. She asked what went wrong in there. She wanted to know if the attorney was stalling on releasing the money. Renee came around to face Derek squarely, no attempt to keep her voice down. The receptionist, the junior associates drifting past, none of it registered. She leveled one trembling finger at his chest, and she gave her parents the unfiltered truth. No settlement, no inheritance. For the last 5 years, she told them she had been married to a financial parasite who hadn't paid for a single thing in their lives, every comfort funded by an allowance from his father. Her father tucked his phone away. He got to his feet unhurried and straightened the front of his suit. His face moved through irritation and landed somewhere colder, outright contempt. He looked at Derek the way someone looks at something they can't believe made it into the room. He asked if what she was saying was true. He wanted a straight answer was, the house, the car, the entire polished lifestyle, nothing but an act subsidized by a retired logistics man. Derek's eyes stayed down. He fixed on his scuffed shoes and fumbled for words that wouldn't assemble. It was just a rough patch he managed. His father was making a point. He insisted the trust would be challenged and overturned. All he needed was a few weeks to put together his own legal team and straighten things out. Renee's laugh arrived like a pane of glass hitting pavement. No warmth, no hesitation, nothing behind it but ice. She walked her parents through the leather binder. She laid out the itemized invoice proof that Derek couldn't cover the food in their kitchen, let alone a luxury cruise or the mortgage on a multi-million-dollar home. She unpacked every claim he'd ever made about his earnings, his career, his independence, and she dismantled each one in front of them. Then she told them about the disinheritance, permanent, official, irrevocable. The quiet that followed hit like a wall. Derek's carefully constructed identity was completely dissolved right there in the middle of a corporate lobby. He extended a hand in her direction. He urged her to breathe, to think about what they'd promised each other. He asked her to remember that the two of them were in this together, that they could find their footing again, with or without his father's money. Renee moved back a step, her face closed and cold. She said she had signed on to be with someone who could stand on his own 2 feet, not someone who needed a parent to cover his grocery bill. He had made her look like a fool in front of her own family torched their vacation, and dragged her into the wreckage of a life built entirely on borrowed money. She made it crystal clear she was going back to her parents' estate, and her first call would be to a divorce attorney. She told him never to contact her again. Her father moved forward and set a steady hand on Renee's shoulder. He took one final look at Derek. His voice stayed even. No threats, no raised hand. He simply told Derek that he was a complete failure of a man. He made it known that any attempt to show up at their property or reach out to his daughter would bring the police down on him immediately. Then he turned his back and didn't look again. Renee's mother didn't even grant Derek a glance. She looped her arm through Renee's and steered her toward the elevators without a word. The silver doors parted with a quiet chime. All 3 of them moved into the polished cab. Renee faced forward, her expression locked into a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. The doors drew shut, cutting Derek out of her world for good. He was left standing alone in the vast hollow lobby. The receptionist kept her gaze trained on her monitor, doing her best to pretend she hadn't just watched a marriage come apart at the seams. Derek stood motionless, staring at those closed elevator doors. No wife beside him. No wealthy in-laws ready to write a check. No house to go back to. No vehicle to drive away in. His hand found his pocket and closed around the single silver key to the storage unit. That key was the only thing in the world he could call his own. He turned slowly and made his way toward the heavy glass exit doors at the front of the building. He pushed through into the punishing heat of the downtown financial district. The city rushed on around him, utterly indifferent to his undoing. He folded into the stream of pedestrians and disappeared, just another invisible man on a street with nowhere on earth to be. The wet sand pressed firm beneath my bare feet. Late afternoon light was spilling across the water as the coastal sun began its long slide toward the horizon, painting everything in deep gold. The steady thunder of the waves drowned out the rest of the world. For 35 years, my life had run on loud, grinding noise, diesel engines at the logistics company, office phones that never stopped, and eventually the entitled, demanding voices that had taken over my own home. Out here, there was nothing but wind and open water. I moved slowly along the shoreline, feeling the cool surf run over my ankles and pull back into the sea. There was a time when I believed my whole purpose as a father was to act as a permanent buffer between my son and reality. I thought absorbing his pain was what good fathers did. I had carried the weight of his poor decisions, his mounting debts, his desperate need to earn the admiration of a woman who couldn't hide her contempt for me. I carried it long enough that I forgot what it felt like to stand without it pressing down on me. Today my shoulders were remarkably unburdened, that persistent tightness in my chest gone. I was breathing slowly, pulling in the clean salt air, with nothing at all to dread. A soft pulse rippled against my left wrist. I stopped and looked down at my smartwatch. The screen lit up against the dimming light, an encrypted email notification from Gordon. I tapped the glass to open it. Gordon is not a man who wastes words, and his final report was characteristically brief. The subject line said, "Only matter concluded." 3 sentences in the body. He confirmed that the meeting at his office had run its course. He reported that the parties in question had been shown the complete financial invoice and formally notified of their absolute disinheritance. He stated that they had left the building without mounting any legal challenge and that the charitable trust was fully sealed and beyond reach. I read through the message a second time, letting the reality find its place in me. The trap had closed. The fiction had collapsed. Derek was out in the open world. Now the false floor I had built beneath him, finally gone. He had chosen to throw me away for a luxury vacation. He had picked the approval of his in-laws over the steady, quiet loyalty of his own father. All I had done was step out of the way and allow his choices to find him. No screaming, no confrontation played out in front of an audience. Just a quiet surgical correction to something that had been broken for a very long time. A deep sense of closure moved through me. There was no bitterness left in it, no hunger to twist the knife. The anger had burned off entirely, leaving behind a wide, clean stillness. I was no longer the old man tucked away in the guest house out of sight. I was no longer the silent account that kept a poisoned marriage running. I was a man on a beach with the whole remainder of his life belonging entirely to himself. I reached into the pocket of my linen shorts and pulled out my phone. I held it for a moment, looking at the dark screen, knowing I'd never have to read another frantic, grasping message from that chapter of my life. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it until the device shuddered once and went dark. I slid it back into my pocket. I turned my face toward the water. The horizon stretched out ahead of me, wide open and full of everything still possible. A real smile came to me, then unhurried and unforced. I looked away from the city, away from everything behind me, and walked on down the shore. And that was the end of it, not with a fight, not with a dramatic scene on my doorstep. Just a quiet walk down a shoreline with the weight of years finally lifted from my shoulders. I spent a long time believing that protecting Derek from consequences was the same as loving him. It wasn't. Real love sometimes means stepping back and letting the bill come due. I believe God allowed all of it, the years of silence, the dismissal, the hurt, because He was preparing me for the moment I'd finally choose myself. That moment cost me my son, but it gave me back my life. If you've been listening to Grandpa Revenge stories and wondering whether any of this could really happen, I want you to know that this kind of quiet reckoning is more common than people talk about. These are the father stories that never make the headlines, but they live in the hearts of a lot of people who gave everything and were handed contempt in return. Here is what I'd want you to take from this. Never confuse generosity with obligation. What you give freely can be taken for granted, but it is never truly owed. If someone only values you for what you fund, remove the funding and watch what remains. Do not let loyalty to a title, a son, a spouse silence your own dignity for a single day longer than necessary. And when the door finally closes on something that was costing you everything, do not look back. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought I read every single one. And if you haven't already, come join us here at Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.